Hello, we're back with Michael Ventura for the third part of our series about his life. And in the last part, we were in Maine in the period from around 61 to 63. And why don't you take it from there, Michael?
Okay, well, in September of 63, I went to if I'm going to curse the place, I shouldn't name it. It's really not fair. A podunk college in Vermont. And I wasn't especially keen on going to college. But the people of the All Souls Unitarian Church in Manhattan, who had been supporting me with the Laws family in Maine, had been paying my expenses and bought me a typewriter in the beginning of my 11th grade that I worked on, until that 1990, and who had saved my life, along with the Laws family. But they expected me to go to college, and they hadn't done all this to raise a vagabond, and I knew that. And so I picked a college in Vermont that didn't seem to honor us, and intended to do my best. I was very disappointed the week I got there. It was clear that my high school was 1,000 times better than this college. And it was clear most of these people weren't interested in learning. They were interested in a lot of self-expression. They thought they already knew it all. And they said they were writers, and they said they were artists. One friend said he was an opera singer. I said, but they had no music program here. He got very angry at me for that. And I made friends. I was on my way to having a good time when I called my mother for her birthday, and she wasn't in the hotel where she normally stayed when she was out of the hospital. Couldn't find her, called her brother, couldn't find her, he couldn't find her. And I hitchhiked with my friend Michael Berger, who you know, Brandon.
Yeah.
I hitchhiked with Mikey to New York. His people lived in the Bronx. They were fanatical opera and symphony goers, and it was fun to meet them. But my mother had turned up at what's the name of the place? Kings Park in Long Island Mental Hospital. The place was a dungeon. The place was awful. And my uncle picked me up, and we went out there. And my uncle had been very successful in his trade, which is he was an electronic engineer. He had a house on Long Island, the family. And he's my mother's brother. And we visited her. She was, as you might imagine, not in good shape. And the perspective, let's see, she's born 18, so 20. She was only about 45, 44. I was September of 63, 17. I would turn 18 in October. And on the way back from seeing her, my uncle proposed that when she got out of the hospital, which wasn't going to be for maybe a year, he would stake us to an apartment in the Bronx, and my mother would get a job, file clerk, something like that. I would get a job, and we'd get my sister out of the orphanage. And I just very calmly said yes. It was the way I was raised. And I wasn't doing anything special. Elder brothers and elder sisters, for all of history, have taken on these responsibilities. It's been expected of them in many cultures, and in mine. And I didn't think I was doing anything out of the ordinary.
So this was you go to school in September of '63,
Yep.
and then
And
how long are you
at the end of September? At the end of September.
So you're only there for a month before you have to go and see your mom.
There wasn't any point in being anywhere else, so I stayed in school that semester and the next semester.
Yeah.
And there were some important things toward my writing in that school. There was a course on Scandinavian literature that I took, since I'd never even heard of Scandinavian literature, and discovered some very fine writers who had a big influence on me, especially Isak Dinesen, which is the pen name for Karen von Blixen. And in the second semester, there was a man named Victor Lopez, who had been a refugee from the Spanish Civil War and had known Federico Garcia Lorca. And he was an alcoholic. He was very fey, but he was the real deal. And I wrote a personal assignment for him that was very important to my thought in life. It was a comparison between Don Quixote and the book of Matthew, the Gospel according to Matthew. It was the first time I'd read the Gospel, period. We mostly get it from ministers and priests and pastors, but to read it straight on just as a story was very powerful. I don't mean in a religious way, but in a sense of, here was this person doing this thing and saying these things, and it's been a very powerful story for a couple of thousand years. In that sense, and reading Cervantes, which was the first really modern novel, and is still outdistances most novels. It's also very funny, but and sad. So those were big things in the process of my thought. Meeting Mikey Berger was a big thing. We were friends until he died 3 years ago.
And all this occurs. The assassination is in November of '63, right? So.
Right.
Okay.
So that's what I'm coming to.
Oh, okay.
And then suddenly, Kennedy was killed. And even though I was ambivalent about Kennedy, as I spoke about last time, and his policies, etc., it was a huge thing. It had an incredible shock effect. And I wasn't in that mass weeping kind of thing that was going on at the time. A lot of people didn't even like Kennedy. Kennedy, he had sort of middling poll numbers the day before he was shot. But it was a phenomenon. It was solemn. People were truly jarred. And for the first time in history, in the history of media, everybody was glued to their television sets, though nothing was happening in particular, except my mother happened to be watching in the community room in the mental hospital when Lee Harvey Oswald was shot on live TV. I didn't see it live, but, we all saw it. We all saw the funeral. We all saw the little boy lift his hand and salute. And at the time, and this is it's almost hard to believe. At the time, people just believed what the government was telling them by and large. Disagreed with it, but believed it. Didn't think they'd be flat out lied to. Now, I was shocked during the U.2 crisis when Dwight Eisenhower was caught in a flat out lie. But it wasn't a shaking thing. It was just sort of an educational thing. But Kennedy assassination happening at the end of November. I'm trying to really find words because so much has been said and there's so much bullshit all around it in all kinds of ways.
Right.
It's clear, you know, when you and I went there, that Dealey Square was a lot smaller
Yeah.
than it ever looked.
Yeah.
In any kind of film. That how could the shooters miss? You know, it was amazingly small.
It really was kind of like a cauldron. The way
was.
it was set up. Yeah.
And you know, and then you think of this and the other thing, and how can the Secret Service let him be in that position? All kinds of things. But then you go to just plain complacency and whatever it was. I mean, there hadn't been an assassination, a serious assassination attempt in 30 years, and there hadn't been a successful one in more than 60 years. So it was this shock. But the interesting thing for me was it was about 2.5 weeks later that the Beatles' first record got played in the U.S. And by New Year's, so end of December, just like 5 weeks later, 6 weeks later, there's Beatlemania.
Yeah.
And I had my first sort of, how can I put it? My first cultural thought in my life. I thought, I'll bet if everybody hadn't been mourning for the Kennedy assassination, the pendulum wouldn't have swung. There wouldn't be a Beatlemania.
Yeah. Yeah.
There was all this shared emotion in the Western world, and then there was all this shared elation. And both were about equally crazy. The elation was more fun. And the Beatles did have a fresh music, a fresh sound. And that was real. And, you know, the day the Beatles, I was working, this college had closed for the winter because it was in Vermont. You don't want to spend a Vermont winter in those kind of quarters. And just the heating bill would have killed the college. And I was working, of all places, at Rikers Island in New York City, the prison, which at the time you took a ferry to get to.
Really?
Now they have a bridge, yeah. I was in the mailroom. And Mikey's mother had gotten me this job. She was a civil servant in City Hall, and she knew strings to pull. She got me a job. And I was in the mailroom where you process the inmates' mail.
Mm-hmm.
You processed any money they were sent. You processed if they were sent cigarettes. That went through a whole thing. And if their girlfriends sent them dirty pictures, you had to report that. I didn't. I later learned that was a felony. And frankly, you know, I mean, maybe this isn't the time and place, but if my girlfriend sends me a Polaroid of herself doing something without clothes on, I want to know who's taking the damn picture.
Yeah,
you know? And you know, we were instructed not to talk to the trustees. We ate. At our lunchtime, we were kind of marched along the cell blocks and ate in the cafeteria with the prison population at our own table in the corner. And it's those 2 months working at Rikers Island when I decided I did not ever want to go to jail.
Yeah.
For anything that wasn't big. If I'm going to do something that's going to maybe stick me in jail, it's going to be something big. Or something I really believe in. Because even then, and now it's 100 times worse, when you were there, you just didn't want to be there. But this is relating to the Beatles in this sense. The day they came to play the Ed Sullivan Show. New York, which was now New York has $5,000 a month rent for a little room. New York in the early '60s was still a working class town. It had rich people, and they had their neighborhoods on the east side of Manhattan and here and there. But basically, this was a working class town where people had lived in their apartments for a generation. My stepmother, Margie, was born in the apartment that her parents still lived in under the L on Palmetto Street, under the Myrtle Avenue L, when it goes off from Myrtle and turns up Palmetto. Neighborhoods were neighborhoods. The delis had been there forever. There was only very, very. This was right at the time when supermarkets that don't look anything like the supermarkets today. They were much smaller, but they were all big in delis. And delis kept a tab. They knew payday was the end of the month for a lot of people, or welfare checks were the beginning of the next month for a lot of people, and Social Security, and you could go in and they'd put it on my tab, and at the end of the month you paid the tab. The supermarkets didn't do that, but the supermarkets cut prices, and people went for the lower prices, and the delis disappeared over the course of the '60s. The neighborhood culture of the big cities, not only New York, but Boston, the big East Coast cities, Philly, Pittsburgh, out to Chicago, Cleveland. That culture changed
right.
in the '60s from that kind of local neighborhood culture to what ended up 2 decades later as the Walmart culture.
Yeah.
That was the beginning of that change.
There were still ethnic communities, and I mean, at least from my perception in Manhattan today, it's the only Gentiles are the blacks, I think, and I mean, you don't have Italians and Polish, and I mean, if they moved out to the suburbs, yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I don't know what you mean by Gentiles, but that's okay. We'll go on that.
Well, not non-Jews. I mean,
yep.
The only white-skinned people, I mean, just from my perception in Manhattan now are Jewish.
No, I don't think so. Right now, what you've got in New York are right now the highest real estate is in Brooklyn, and you've got people from out of town. You don't have New Yorkers. People from out of town who come to New York, the cultural centers, the financial centers, the recording, the movie studios, and most of those people weren't born there.
Right.
And so far as there is still a Jewish enclave in Brooklyn, but that's it. The population in Manhattan from Harlem on down is affluent one way or the other. I was in.
I'm not going to argue this with you, but yeah.
I was there for a movie meeting in the year 2000.
Yeah.
And I was on Manhattan in the Tribeca area, and it was 24 hours before I heard a New York accent. And that was 20 years ago. But in any case, back then, it was a working class place. The West Side was rich, blah, blah, blah. There was you had, I can't remember the name of the big Jewish neighborhood near Coney Island, but, African Americans were in Bed-Stuy and Harlem, mainly in the South Bronx. Italians and Irish all kind of come together by that time, but it was a working class place. And the day the Beatles came, and it was a tough place and kind of a grouchy place, short, killing each other. I never saw anything like it. It was weird. And they would be on Ed Sullivan, so they were right there in Times Square when the Sullivan Show was shot, or near there. And it was just the mood of the city changed. It was enormous cultural event that nobody was calling culture. I knew a gal from a good friend of mine from a fancy school, who some of those girls were delegated to meet the Beatles, and my friend was too cultural to do it. She thought it was beneath her. And I lost touch with her a long time ago, so I don't know whether she regrets that. But in any case, there I was. Now we're in '64. In the fall of '64, getting a job, and my mother and I getting a job. She became a file clerk of some kind. I could always type, so in those days, if you could type, you could get a job. And what was I going to do as a writer? When in the fall, my mother and I were walking in Union Square because her brother had given us a stake to get, what you need in New York. And one of the things you need is winter clothing, because as you know, now living in Canada, you need a wardrobe for winter, a wardrobe for summer, a wardrobe for spring. And we were on our way to get a winter coat, and we were always pretty frank with each other. And I said, "Ma, the only thing that worries me is that when all this is over, will I still be a writer? Will I be a writer?" And my mother said, "When all this is over, you'll know whether or not you're a writer." And she was right. She was basically saying, "Look, kid, that part of your life is totally up to you. That's on you. Nobody can do it for you, and nobody can do it with you. That's on you." And I realized that I was going to have to educate myself from here on. I considered myself an American writer, or a wannabe American writer. I was going to have to educate myself about what American writing was. I was going to have to educate myself about what American history. And I started reading. And the great thing about working in Manhattan and living in the Bronx is you got at least an hour and a half a day, sometimes more than 2 hours a day. When you're on the ground in stations and subways, or you're waiting on an L station in the Bronx, and you're doing a lot of waiting, you're doing a lot of writing on trains. And I always had a book. I read more than I ever read in my life. Later, there was lunch hour, there was going to work, there was coming back from work. I had a book of history, or I had a book of an American writer. I started with the earliest American writing I knew. As I said, we weren't taught women in my high school, so I didn't know about the country's first poet, Anne Bradstreet, one of the Pilgrims. So the earliest one I really knew about, who was a fiction writer, was, oh my God, I just blanked on his name. It's wonderful being 76. Washington Irving, and the tales that Sleepy Hollow was a part of, which are really satires on American materialism, which was showing up in spades in the more successful colonies. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow is a satire on American materialism.
Really?
Yeah, it's not a horror story at all. It's a satire. If you read it the way people read it then, they're laughing at themselves. And Poe, looking at the dark side of it all, saying, looking at the same America and saying, there's something very dark here. You people are living it, but you're not aware of it. There's something very dark going on around here, and in our hearts here. And even Fenimore Cooper, which The Last of the Mohicans was kind of a radical novel, 1826. You had the bond between Chingachgook and who was adopted, Hawkeye, and their bond, and Hawkeye's bond with his brother, Uncas. And that was, to put it mildly, frowned upon. And so I would go through, I went through. There was very few people I didn't read, at least some of, starting back in the early 19th century on. And I would read in lunch hour. Well, at Radio TV Reports, where I was working, at first it was on 47th Street between 6th and 7th, between 6th and 5th. And in the jewelry section, the jewelry neighborhood, a bunch of jewelry stores there, very big time. And another thing that was right on that street was the Gotham Film Mart, one of the most famous bookstores of the 20th century. And going into that bookstore was one of the most wonderful things. The books were everywhere, and these sort of hobbit kind of people who ran the place knew where every goddamn book was. You couldn't find anything. But if you asked somebody, oh, yes, I think I have that upstairs. Yeah. And he goes, and this happened to me. I wanted a copy of Robert Payne's book on Charlie Chaplin. And, oh, yeah, how many people have ever heard of that? Oh, yes, I think that's upstairs. I think we have one. I followed him upstairs with stacks and stacks and stacks. He gets me this little paperback of the book. And their knowledge was incredible that way. And you could go there and browse. You could stand there and read. There wasn't any place to sit down.
Before you move on to, before you go on to the job at News Radio, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I kind of wanted. I don't know if, like, when you went to Rikers Island, you just took the ferry there and walked straight into an office, or if you could give any insight on what Rikers Island was like at that time, and what the environment was like. If you encounter, I guess you ate lunch with them and everything, but if you can do that.
You took a ferry.
Yeah.
And it was winter. And that was as cold as I've ever been.
Yeah.
You had wind whipping up the East River. If you weren't early enough to get in where the heaters were, you were on the deck. It was incredibly cold and wet cold. And if it happened to be raining or snowing, and you were on the deck, you were just out of luck. You just could be as miserable as you could be for about however long. It wasn't a long ferry ride, 15, 20 minutes, even when the weather was bad. But if that. And then you went in the civilian part of the prison, and there were lockers and such. It was cut off from the main population. And then you went to the mailroom, which was in that civilian part, and there would be 2 or 3 trustees who could work in the mailroom, who you were instructed not to do any favors for, not to talk to.
So you're working right next to them, but you can't speak to them?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And it was a cushy job, their job in the mailroom.
Yeah.
So they had pleased somebody to get there, or paid somebody to get there. But yeah, you couldn't speak to them. They really don't do them any favors. In other words, smuggling and stuff. And then we were walked through a cell block, and it's just like in the movies. the older movies, because they didn't have the electronic doors and stuff. They were cells, 2, 3 guys to a cell, as I recall. The population was, at the time, in my memory, it was pretty balanced. Everybody was working class, to my eye. There may have been a few who weren't, but this was a working class bunch in there. And it was ethnic, quote-unquote, white people, Italians, Irish, seemed to be about, I don't know, a fourth of it. Puerto Ricans and African Americans were mostly the rest. It was quiet. I mean, there was the sounds weren't quiet. The atmosphere was quiet.
Yeah,
in the cafeteria.
I'm interested to know about this because it seems like at least starting in 1966, the prison culture really changes, and the perception of prison in the public starts to change too. Where in '66 there starts to be prison gangs, like real prison gangs that have real power, and they have power on the street, and then you start getting things like Johnny Cash, and a kind of like an entrance of prison criminal culture into popular media. And so I was just interested to see like what it sounds like. It was pretty different before that time period of the late 60s, that like the quiet atmosphere you're talking about. It sounds like a mutually respectful atmosphere. Not as racially divided, maybe.
Not as racially divided. It wasn't. I didn't get the sense of all the blacks being in one place, all the whites being in another place. And like I said, that kind of gang life hadn't come to the street yet. There were teenage gangs in Brooklyn. There was the Halsey Street Bops. There was they were the ones we had to worry about. But basically, it was kid on kid. There were switchblades and that kind of thing. There were fights, but drugs hadn't hit the street yet.
Right.
And drugs hadn't hit the culture. So what you had at Rikers when the brief time I was there, early '64, was your basic
thief.
It was what you saw in the movies in the 30s. In the
Right.
30s, there were a bunch of movies about prison.
Yeah.
And that held pretty true for what I was seeing at Rikers. I'd seen the movies, and this wasn't different from those movies. And criminals expected to get caught. And I did a script based on the autobiography of one of these kind of guys. You expected, he would say, Archie Eddie Bunker was his name. Eddie Bunker.
Okay.
And you're going to get caught sooner or later, and you learn how to do your time. And you learned how to, what he called, build your time. You said that when you got out, you knew you were going to probably go back, but because that was the life you led, and that's how you made your money, and those are the people you knew. But then it changed.
Okay.
So that's what I got for that.
Okay. News radio and Gotham bookstore.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the problem that I was having was who am I? What am I doing? I'm going to be getting my sister out of St. Joseph's. I had all these dreams. What's going to happen to them? And there was a woman who worked at Radio TV. She was older. She was probably born in the late 19th century. She was in her 70s at least. She was called Miss Beaufort. And if she liked you a lot, you could call her Beau. And she was quite formal, calling you Mr. Ventura, Mr. So-and-so, Mr. So-and-so. And she was treated with a lot of respect. She was doing the same job I got, scanning tapes, scanning reel-to-reel tapes of radio shows and television shows and interview shows. It was kind of a clipping service of the broadcast media. My direct supervisor was African-American guy, Benny Banks. He was the line man, as they called him. There was Miss Beaufort. There was blacklisted writers. There were openly gay queens. It was a place that had 3 shifts, worked 7 days a week, was going 7 days a week, and actors between jobs. It was a very, if you were going to do that kind of work in Manhattan, I've landed in the best place to do it. The money sucked. There was no sick days, no paid sick leave, no insurance of any kind. Nobody expected that then. But it was interesting people. It was very interesting people. And if you liked the news and all that, it was like to know what was going on in the world. It was a good place to be. And I never minded going to work. I enjoyed the people there. But I was there for about 4 years. But I'm there now for like 6 weeks. And China has just exploded its first atom bomb. That was one of the headlines that October. I'm reading in my lunch hours. And they can see I'm reading real books, you know. And Ms. Beaufort comes up to me after about, a few weeks, 6, 7 weeks. And she says, Mr. Ventura. She spoke very properly. Reminded me a little of Katharine Hepburn. That kind of New England proper. Mr. Ventura, what are you about? And I said, mumbled something about, well, I'll be a writer. And she said, do you write every day? If you're to be a writer, you must write every day. And I knew that was true. It was the best single teaching I ever had in my life. I knew what she was saying was the difference between ending up like Michael Luciano Ventura, my father, driving a cab and being a very entertaining cab driver. We'd read a few books and this and that. And it was an interesting cabbie. We talked about the blah, blah, blah. And being a writer. And I knew I was going to have to write every day. And I knew that was the only way. I mean, it was like the metaphor that as I talk of it, it's like an arrow right through my forehead. Woof. This is true. This is what you have to do. And from then on, my sister and my mother would go to bed by 10:30 or so. And later on, we also had my 2 brothers, the twins, Vinny and Aldo. And I'd stay up and work on mostly poetry for an hour or 2. And those days, I never got tired. I could go for 2 hours, 2 hours sleep, 4 hours sleep, 3 hours sleep. I'd be fine the next day. And this was respected in my family. If I was working on a weekend, my mother or my sister would materialize a cup of coffee in front of me. I wouldn't even know. I'd suddenly realize it was there. And my mother certainly approved. And a big thing, and this is a big thing, that I don't want to neglect saying. From high school on, there were a few people who believed in me. My friend Carl Laws in high school believed in me in terms of being a writer. My dear friend Peggy Flanagan from Queens, she believed in me. My mother believed in me. And Dave Johnson believed in me. That was enough. A few people who believed in me. So I didn't think I was completely crazy or foolish. A few people who read some things of mine and said, oh, that's pretty good, actually. You know, for being young and all that. But In fact, my friend Peggy, and this is when I was still in high school, I had written a poem. And she was going to a super good school, Hunter High School, where my mother had gone to school. And it was Hunter High School and Hunter College. It was strictly for women then. And had a very high reputation. You had to take tests to get in and all that. So Peggy was going when my mother went to school. And she entered a poem of mine as her own, not to be plagiarizing, but to see if anybody else thought it was good. And it won the contest. But so there were people who believed in me. So I wasn't just totally alone in this. There were people I could send my poems to who would be honest about it. Carl was very honest about it. And the other thing that happened in the 11th grade, the church, the Unitarian Church of All Souls in Manhattan, had gifted me that Olympia portable typewriter that I typed on, did all my work on until like 1990.
Yeah.
Oh my God, where am I going with that? And I can't remember where I was going with that.
You were talking about people that believed in you and the Unitarian Church had given you that typewriter.
And so it was a consistent thing in my life, this typewriter, from the 11th grade on.
Yeah.
So, I had my axe, as the musicians say, and there were people I'd write letters to, and that was the other big thing about writing in my 20s. I wrote letters. If I saw a movie I liked, I wrote a letter to a friend about it. If I read a book I liked, I wrote a letter to a friend. If I saw the stuff at Rikers Island, I wrote letters. I wrote letters to, they were sometimes like 2,000-3,000 words long. But always about 1,000 words, 900 words, single space page is about 500 words, with the font on my typewriter. And that's why later, when I had the column, when I decided when I pushed LA Weekly to shift me from being strictly a film critic to being a columnist as well, I called it Letters at 3 a.m. That's when I wrote my letters. And I wanted it to have that personal tone of writing to somebody I knew about something I was interested in and trusting the reader to get it. And being frank, being direct. And so on the one hand, I was writing poetry and considering myself a poet, which I still do. But on the other hand, I was writing these letters about all kinds of things. And in terms of the work I would do for the rest of my life, that was the real training practice. On the one hand, at Coburn Classical Institute in Waterville, Maine, I'd been given and taught and developed certain skills in research, in composition, and by very good teachers who knew what they were talking about. And then I used those skills primarily writing letters over the next decade. And that was my apprenticeship, really, in a funny way. I interviewed Jack Nicholson when Pritzi's Honor came out. I interviewed Jack Nicholson for the LA Weekly, and a question I like to ask when I was interviewing actors and directors was what would you say to somebody young coming up? And Nicholson said, "You'll get your shot. Be ready." The work I was doing in my 20s, which was mostly letters and poetry, was me getting ready. And the reading I was doing was me getting ready. And it was interesting because I had no idea. I didn't know how long I was going to be supporting my brothers and sisters. I didn't know how to get from the Bronx to the printed page. Especially, I hadn't gone to college. You know, I got a couple of semesters at a podunk school. You know, how was I going to get from here to there was the big question. But that's what I was doing while I was working and supporting those people and doing that stuff. I was really taking my stand as a writer, and I would say this, that's the first and hardest step. You're going to take your stand as a writer no matter how it pans out. What my mother said was true. When this is over, you'll know whether or not you're right. There's a lot of excuses not to be. And most people who start don't continue very long for good reasons. It's not really their thing to do. It's this, it's that. But for me, I could say I was a writer because now I was writing every day.
Yeah.
I sat down to it every day.
How much of a factor do you think that fear is in people not continuing to write?
Oh, it's huge.
Yeah.
it's pure insecurity. And it's what I call the talent of the room. Look, there are people who are much more gifted than me. And you know some of them. I don't want to name names in a public forum. People more gifted than me who couldn't hack it in the sense of they could do stuff I couldn't do, like raise families. I didn't do that. But the talent of the room is you're going to be in this room alone doing this indefinitely. And you don't know whether it's good or bad. You don't know whether I just spent 14 years writing a novel. I don't know if it's ever going to see the light of day in terms of being printed. You know, right now it's too expensive for us to print it ourselves. It can be done. That's an avenue that wasn't open to me back then. So, but it can be done online. But maybe I'm just going to leave it in the drawer.
Yeah.
And for Jazz to maybe publish afterwards. Maybe it'll get a publisher.
I want to ask you something.
Mm-hmm.
What gives you more satisfaction, the finishing of the book or that book getting published?
Oh, finishing the book.
Yeah.
Finishing the book. No, doing the book. Look, getting published is nice. And it has its downsides, you know. A lot of people are going to not like it. A lot of people, you know, there's all kinds of, you send it out into the world and it takes its chances like a kid. And some of them get beat up and some of them do okay. But finishing the book, especially a book you really put blood, sweat, and tears into, sticking with it, realizing the first draft isn't what you want, realizing the second draft isn't there yet, letting it dry for about a year, coming back, not putting it aside, and you're doing this alone. Even if you show it to a friend, even if somebody likes it, you know, that helps. Don't get me wrong. Having somebody believe in you helps enormously. But the talent of the room is being able to be in whatever that room is. For me, sometimes in the Bronx, it was the kitchen table. You know, sometimes the room wasn't even in the apartment. The room was in the subway. The room was in a cafe, a luncheonette. But you're there by yourself no matter how many people are around you. And you have to hack that, and you don't know if you're any good. Now, I've been doing this for a long time, and I published a bunch of books. And do I know that this novel is any good? I think it is. but, you know, and a few people around me think it is, but you got to go on faith when you're doing it. You just believe in the idea, believe in what you're doing, and face it every day. And one of the things, I didn't originate this, but the thing about writing a novel, for sure, is that you've got to be good every day. And if you're a poet or a short story writer primarily, it's kind of a different thing. You can work every day, but you're working in a much more concentrated medium. You're writing a book that's 500 type pages long. You got to be good every day. And you got to connect page 1 with page 50, and page 50 with page 82, with page 500. And that can be a real juggling act. So the people who fall away from this and who decide not to do it, it's hard. It's hard. Whether you're good or bad, doing it is hard. There's a book called Letters to a Young Poet. Rainer Rilke, the German poet, a young poet, wrote him, and he answered a few. It's a slim book. A few of these. He answered the young poet, and that person, whose name I forget right now, saved the letters and published them as letters to a young poet. He leaves himself out of it. He just puts Rilke in, and there's a point at which he asks Rilke, "Am I a poet? Am I a writer?" And Rilke replied, and I'm not doing this verbatim, I don't think, but from memory, Rilke replied, "Ask yourself every morning, can I live without writing? And if you can, don't. It's too difficult. Don't do it. Don't put yourself through it. If you can live without writing, live without writing." And that's what I found more than anything else. That even people like Ginger Varney, a very successful writer on the LA Weekly, woke up one morning and just went, "I don't want to do this anymore. It's too goddamn hard." And she became a private detective and had many interesting adventures as a private detective. But she said, I don't pick up a pen except to sign a check. And probably doesn't even do that anymore. And so you've got people, even people who've been successful, just turn around and say, "No, I can't do this anymore." We who can do it are very fortunate in that we have the talent of the room, and that's something like, the talent. I don't consider it any more elevated than a shortstop who makes it look easy when it's really, really hard. It's very rare somebody can do that well. But that guy makes it look easy. He's got the talent, but he's got a body not so different from you. But he can do it. He was given that gift. And he worked on it and honed it so that it works at this highly professional level. It's more or less the same thing. You have a gift to compose words in a certain way and to see in a certain way, and you hone it, you work at it, because you're given the raw material. The gift is the raw material. The honing it, the working on it, the making it really yours, that's the work. But that's what does it. What Miss Wilford said long, long ago now, nearly 60 years ago. You write every day? If you have to be a writer, you must write every day. The interesting thing was that you get to a point where you can't not write every day. so much part of your life you can't not do it. At least that's what happened to me. Which sounds like a good place to break.
Yeah, okay. All right. Okay, well, thanks again. I'll stop here.